Welcome back to Close Mode. I'm continuing a 4-part series with Brian Dietmeyer on strategic negotiation. Again, Brian wrote the book that I'm holding up here right now on this process of how to negotiate and close more deals. In the last episode, we talk about how to estimate the very beginning, because again, we're all about taking negotiation and moving it away from tips and tricks and tactics and moving it into a strategic process. So in the last episode, we talked about what it takes to actually estimate and get some of the data we need up front, just out of what we have available internally. In this next stage, we're talking about how to signal and validate in order to kind of get aligned with reality, how to take what we've estimated and actually put some meat on the bones. So we actually have some real data to work with. So, and I think I summarized that right. Is that right, Brian?
You did.
Is that what signal validate
yes,
is?
You did. Keep going. Just finish the podcast. You're doing great.
That's about as far as I go. So I have to turn it over to you. I'm like signal and validate. I don't know how we're signaling and validate. I'm a noob at this stuff, but I'm sure having a fun time learning, because sales is a strategic, I don't know, a strategic service, but certainly a massive part of growing our company's revenue. Without it, marketing can do everything it can do to try to prime people. But with these larger decisions that need to be made, you're not going to get there without being able to customize the solution for the end buyer. So I'm learning a ton. So Brian, kind of give me an overview of what you mean by signal and validate, and why it makes up its all own step in this strategic negotiation process.
Well, in the first step, just a quick recap, we said that 97% of the dialogue is going to be the customer referring to their alternative or putting pressure on you to give stuff away. So we want to know a lot about both of those things, right? And in the first step, we took a stab at who's the most likely alternative, what's the criteria customers should be using, what are all the commercial terms. Now, in signaling validation, it's quite easy. The better we've done that first step, this is an opportunity to simply put those things into questions, right? And I'll give you an example for this. So one of our customers is in the sort of data management technology space. Their customers use their data to make decisions and have insights. And they were selling to a massive telecommunications firm. And that firm called them up and said, okay, you either meet this price or we're going to build our own system. And my customer had about 20,000 records embedded in this telecommunications company. So we sat through and we thought through, okay, what's their most likely alternative? It's to do it themselves. What should they be thinking about when they think about building it themselves? And my guys were panicking, by the way. My customer was at the VP of sales level. And so we started thinking, we started with categories and said, all right, well, they would have to design that solution. Then they'd have to build it. Then they'd have to install it and improve it and then maintain it. And then there's risk associated with this. That should be part of the decision process. If it fails and they bought from my client, they can blame it on my client if they build it internally. So we thought through, we already knew what their alternative was, build it themselves. And we thought through these categories and came up with questions about each of these categories. You know, when you think about designing, have you thought about when you think about building and then testing and maintaining and support and the risk associated with it, and turn those into customer facing questions. I'm just curious, Dan, have you thought about this when you think about building your own system? And when we talk about signaling, we didn't so much care if this massive telecommunications concern answered any of our questions. We just wanted to take that really good validation and help guide their decision to put a little fear, uncertainty, and doubt into them. Because they probably hadn't thought, they were either bluffing us or they hadn't thought about many of those things. And we wanted to get that in front of them. So that was all. It was to say, what is that alternative? What is the criteria they should be using and choosing between us? Let's turn that into questions. Signal to get it in front of them. Validation is slightly different, where we have them rack and stack. If you think about design, build, install, like which of these are most to least important to you? Why did you rank them that way? And in those instances, we actually want a response so we can validate. We are validating our estimation from the first step. So that's just the sort of consequences, no agreement, the customer alternative side. The other side is the commercial terms and trades. We know they only want to talk about price. They're saying either you meet this license price. Well, that license price is set on all the stuff we estimated: volume, length of contract, number of users, services that are included, limits of liability, liquidated damages. So the next set of questions we're all about that. Okay, Dan. So we've talked a little bit about your alternative, building your own. Let's talk a little bit about the commercial terms, the business side of this deal. If you look at price, length of contract, volume commitment, et cetera, how would you rack and stack those things? Like, oh, that's interesting. Why did you rack and stack them that way? We actually don't want to know the number they're looking for on those things right now, but we want to broaden the discussion beyond price, right? We want to first get them to realize that building their alternative is going to be very painful and very scary. And the second thing is that there's a lot more to talk about other than price. And price is a zero sum game, right? As long as you and I are just talking about price, we're moving money from my wallet to yours and vice versa. But as soon as we say, okay, there might be a pathway to that price, can we look at changing the volume or the length of contract? And that's why we're asking these questions and signaling and validating around commercial terms to broaden the discussion. The death in doing business deals is same thing, cheaper, right? So what we're getting after first is same thing. Let's think, oh, I can build the same thing myself, or I can even build a better thing myself. Well, let's attack that with our estimation and our signaling. And cheaper is only talking about price. So let's talk about all the commercial terms associated with this deal to realize that the thing that I often tell sellers and deal pursuit teams is that when you won't only talk about price, you're not being a hard A. You're actually being logical, because you don't set your price and then look at volume and length of contract. Those are all intertwined, but the customer wants to just look at that one variable. So we estimate those two things. Very simple. We turn those into customer facing questions, and we have that dialogue to signal, to get those things in their head, or to validate, to find out how they actually feel about them.
So when you're validating, you're also kind of signaling at the same
Yes.
time. These aren't two different
No.
things. By validating and doing it in a discussion, you're also signaling. I can see how you link these two
Yeah.
things together because they are really important. They're accomplishing two things with one set of questions.
Yeah, and I suppose when they respond, it becomes validation. So and you think about it too. I'm going to go back to this analogy that we should be doing a lot of this at the 51-yard line, right? Before waiting too far along in the deal. And when you're early on doing discovery using your selling methodology, it's a lot of open-ended stuff. Hey, Dan, what's keeping you awake at night? What's on your plate for this year? Et cetera, et cetera. This is different. This is guided discovery. These are questions where we've embedded specific aspects of the competing alternative. We've embedded specific aspects of the commercial terms. And it's at a much more granular level as you move through the buy and sell cycle, where we need to get away from those wide open questions and start getting into getting data in front of the customer and leading that conversation.
So while in the estimate stage, this is all pre-discovery call, this signal and validate stage can happen over the course of the first call, but probably multiple calls if you're selling something rather large.
Yeah.
Because the questions and the details, and like they might not even have the right people to validate some of this information that they need to think through. If one of their competing alternatives is to build something in-house, like, well, the guy in charge of that probably needs to be in the next meeting to talk about what that would take and to validate some of these questions. Is that right?
You're absolutely right. And the more complex deals get, you're right, the more kind of discovery sessions or signaling and validation sessions you're having, and with different people. And typically when we're talking to executives, when we're estimating their alternative, we're wondering if the executive buys our solution, how is it going to change business metrics in their organization? Maybe their manufacturing. Is it going to change defect reduction or throughput? Is it going to change their margins? When we get down to the technical level, it's like ease of use. So yes, when we do that analysis of the other side's alternative on the more complex deals, we want to say, how does it look from a CTO's perspective and a frontline, ops manager perspective? Compare their alternative, come up with questions that stakeholder is interested in. So we're influencing that part of the decision process.
Yeah. Is this signaling and validation process usually what's driving the meetings that you're going to have? So you can only get part of it maybe in the first meeting or two, but you're like, hey, can we have a meeting with so and so? And this is literally driving your agenda for the sales meetings.
Yeah.
As you're going through it.
And it's interesting. I'm actually glad you make that point, because the setup of these calls is really important. Most people say, all right, salesperson's coming, they're going to be selling me something. And it's pretty important to say, and maybe on the first one, you're just going to be talking about their alternative, but you frame that to the customer as, we've watched a lot of people make decisions on this kind of technology. And I'd like to share with you some of the best practices we've seen of when people are making decisions on this technology. And it's set up that way. So I'm not here to sell you anything, but I am here to advise you. And we go from saying, what is the customer's decision process? What criteria are they using, to influencing it? To say, and again, as I mentioned in the last segment, you as a seller are much better at understanding how your stuff should be bought than the buyer is, because you deal with this day in and day out. You watch multiple people buy your stuff. You watch them make poor decisions, right? And suboptimal decisions. And a lot of people don't realize, like, inside your organization is a ton of knowledge. And by the way, once you build out the analysis of, let's say with this one, build it myself. The customer's going to build it themselves. Here's who should be involved. Here's the criteria they should be using. Here's some questions associated with that. Use that on the next one. This is why we need to think of negotiating as a process, because we don't want to zero base this every time. So you can share this with your peers, and then there might be another one where it's this named competitor. Hey, I was selling this solution when you guys did the consequence of no agreement, estimation. Can you share with me your work? And even put those on a shared doc somewhere in the organization, and not have people repeating, but there's organizational learning, right? We can make these estimations better each time with people working on a shared doc, and then sharing the questions and which ones are high value, which ones work, which ones don't. We do not want to zero base this past the very first time we do it.
So I'm starting to connect the dots, and I think I missed a step somewhere in between estimate and signaling. But the reason why we do the estimation process, again, it can be short, it can be long, it could just be a one pager, is that the estimates, the information we're putting on the estimates is what's driving the questions we're using during the validation.
Correct.
And I think I knew that, but now I'm making the big connection. I'm like, without the estimation phase,
Yeah.
you do not have the specific questions that you have for them, because while you might have a general list that you go through with everybody, you might change it because you might estimate that what their requirements are, or what some of their alternatives might be different, because they might be coming from a different vertical than you're used to dealing with, or whatever it might be. So your estimation stage is really important so that you can have a good signaling and validation stage by asking the right questions.
Yeah.
And you probably sound a lot smarter in the process.
Well, and I'll back up even one step further upstream from that, keeping in mind that the most likely thing, I can guarantee this with a 97% probability based on our primary research, the customer is going to be looking at your value versus some alternative. And if the goal is to know more about that than they do. If we don't, they're going to say something like, I can get same thing cheaper. Forget cheaper for a moment. Let's go to same thing. You're estimating same thing. You're coming up with questions to signal them on how it's not the same thing. We need to know more than they do, or we're simply going to be reacting to the conversation they want to have. We want to change the conversation. And as you say, and we can do this in a way that we're actually adding value by saying, hey, we've seen this a lot. That's interesting that you say same thing. Let's talk through what that decision process would look like.
How is this process different from using a sales process like Challenger Sale?
Yeah, it's
which I know has a similar kind of consultative approach to selling.
Yeah, it's in one sense it's similar and complementary, because the challengers, most sales methodologies take you to about the 50-yard line, right? You do all that open-ended discovery. You've got who are all the buying influences? What are all the possible alternatives? What are all the reasons pro and con for us versus them? When we start getting to the 50-yard line down to the red zone, we're now looking at who are the key people that are involved? What are the key decision criteria that they're using? What are the key commercial terms we're going to get pressure on? And we want to lead them. If we use your challenger metaphor, we want to continue to challenge and lead them. We don't want to be reacting. So with most sales methodologies, as you move to the sales cycle, it starts getting tighter, right? Key people, key criteria. It's the few things that matter. And we're done now with those open-ended questions. We're done about thinking through what is their decision process. We're actually leading them through an optimal decision process.
That's interesting. So with strategic negotiation, while it does come towards the very beginning of this sales cycle, it's really starting with the end in mind.
Yeah.
It's opening strong so you can close strong. Versus Challenger, it's kind of just starting strong.
Yeah, I mean, you're setting yourselves up for value. We've heard from many sales executives that we sell value and we negotiate price, right? And so we've got to sell value and negotiate value. So this continues that discussion, and it's interesting to me that there are so many folks out there that have done a pretty good job of installing Medic or Miller Hyman or Challenger, and then when it comes to the negotiation phase, they've either done nothing because they think it's very tactical, soft skill, reactive. They don't see it as a process, or they've chosen a class that teaches them tips and tricks, which isn't very fact based. It isn't very data focused. It's not still leading the customer. So the way we approach it, we've actually purpose built the way we do this work to integrate upstream with selling methodology to say, okay, when you're estimating, you should already know some of this stuff. If you've done Challenger properly, you know some of this stuff. So let's now take it a level deeper, that kind of thing.
So that's a great segue for what's going to be part 3 in this series on creating value, right? Since this whole strategic negotiation process is not just about how to negotiate on price, but to negotiate on value. Now that we've done all this pre-work, this estimation, this signaling and validate, what can we then do in order to create value? And I'm looking forward to talking to you about that in our next episode.
Okay. Thanks, Dan.